Wagwan. Good morning, good night, welcome back. And if you're listening for the first time, welcome to episode 17 of The Real Situation, where we give you a taste of Jamaican politics. My name is Melanie Byfield, and before diving into the new happenings in constitutional reform, I just want to mention the fact that it was Martin Luther King Day on Sunday, January 20. And that just happened to coincide with the start of a new hurricane season. You know, see it. But we'll see how that goes. So, January 19. Again, before diving into the constitutional reform on January 19, President Biden issued a pardon of Marcus Garvey. It was a posthumous pardon, which means you're actually forgiven for something that you did wrong after your death. Marcus Garvey was born August 17, 1887 in St. Ann's Bay, Jamaica. He was leader of the largest organized mass movement in Black history and originator of the kind of modern Black is beautiful ideal, representing a liberation from psychological bondage, of racial inferiority. Now, Garvey is best remembered as a champion of the Back to Africa movement, and he advocated for economic and cultural independence to create a new kind of racial pride, right? Garveyism inspired millions of Black people worldwide who sought relief from racism and colonialism. But many feel that the pardon didn't go far enough and that Garvey should have been exonerated, which is when you're actually cleared of a previous conviction. Why? The desire for exoneration? Because members of Congress said in a letter to President Biden that approximately 101 years ago, when Garvey was convicted of fraud, there was prosecutorial and governmental misconduct. It was said that the evidence, it clearly painted that the charges against Garvey were not only fabricated, but they were also targeted to criminalize, discredit, and silence him as a civil rights leader. All of this was done by the former Bureau of Investigation, which would later become the FBI, under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover. He brought the mail fraud charges against Garvey in connection with the sale of Black Star Line shipping stock. Garvey was sentenced to 5 years in prison, served 2, and then he got dipped back to Jamaica in 1927. He never returned to America, but he died in the UK June 10 in 1940. 1969, his body was returned to Jamaica and he was made Jamaica's first national hero. Now, while the pardon is good news, the philosophy and opinions of Marcus Garvey and the uplifting values and attitudes that he represented isn't being taught in schools in Jamaica, even though there have been several launches to do so as far back as August 2012. So there absolutely needs to be not only a national focus, but action in that respect, right? And the question is, who's going to take that action, see it through, and ensure that the philosophies and opinions of Marcus Garvey are a permanent part of the curriculum of all schools in Jamaica? Who? All right, so I'll go on with constitutional reform. Let's have a brief recap. Long time, right? Minute talk to you. So, all right. There was a bill tabled in Parliament December 10, 2024. And this basically, well, I'm not going to repeat the exact name of the act again. What it basically did was it wants to repeal the Constitution Ordering Council of 1962 and put into operation a Constitution of Jamaica, right? It wants to amend the Constitution of Jamaica to provide for a non-monarchical head of state. So they want to remove the monarchy and replace or establish Jamaica as a republic with a president. Basically is what the bill wants to do, in amongst a bunch of other things, right? So why is the bill being tabled? After 62 years, independent Jamaica has a king, an English king, King Charles III, as its executive. The second schedule of the Jamaica Constitution Ordering Council 1962, which granted Jamaica independence and represents the highest law of the land, is a constitutional document. And the part which is in contention, the highest court of appeal is the Privy Council in London. This is the first of 3 phases. We are in the midst of phase 1. Some would say coming to the end of phase 1. And focusing on deeply entrenched provisions of the Constitution. And because they're deeply entrenched, that is removing the monarchy and amending the Constitution, Jamaicanizing it. It requires a referendum, right? Where 2/3 of both houses are required to vote in the affirmative. So that needs at least one member of the opposition in the Senate. The bill came about from recommendations of a 15-member Constitutional Reform Committee who submitted a report back in May 2024. The opposition members of the CRC, members of the opposition party who were members of the CRC, didn't sign the bill because of the fact that the Privy Council was retained, amongst some other major issues as well, but that was the biggest one. And they are advocating to put the Caribbean Court of Justice in place of the Privy Council on the grounds that Jamaica's already paid millions into it for its creation. It's already a member, actually, of one of the 2 branches that interprets and applies law regarding the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, which is the CARICOM agreement, again, amongst other matters, which the opposition did provide in a letter. So now that the bill's been tabled, the Road to Republic website actually has a bill tracker, which is showing you now what's happening, that this bill has been tabled in Parliament. So the next, the current action is that a joint select committee on the Constitution Amendment Republic Act 2024 was established on January 15. And what's their job? To deliberate on the provisions of the bill. So the Joint Select Committee is made up of a combination of the House and Senate. The House members are Marlene Malahoo Fort, who is the chair, Tamika Davis, Karenzia Morrison, Dwayne Smith, Mark Golding, and George Anthony Hilton. The senators are Charles Sinclair, Ransford Braham, Shireen Golding Campbell, Peter Buntin, and Donna Scott Motley. I'm going to summarise some of what took place in that meeting. Marlene Malahoo Fort basically confirmed that, yes, the matter of the final court is an important matter, but the matter's not closed. She went on to say that, in the life of the Parliament, all the stages of the bill are not going to get completed, and the furthest that they can go with cooperation is to have the bill passed by Parliament and the referendum take place in the next Parliament, which depends on the life of the Parliament, which is September 15 if it's dissolved on election. That's the latest date if there's an election. And if there's not an election, then it's automatically dissolved on the 5th anniversary after the first sit-in of the general elections, which would be December 15. She re-emphasised that, nothing will go to the people if Parliament can't agree on the goals in the bill. Now, the leader of the opposition made a clarifying statement, and I'm just going to summarise what that is. He was reaffirming that, yes, everybody wants to, de-link from the British monarchy and more. But the rights and the interests of the people of Jamaica are paramount over and above everything else. He went on to say that the JLP have never actually given an indication of its support to withdraw from the British monarch's court. And what the opposition is seeking is full decolonisation, which consists of 2 actions, not one, moving from the British monarchy and also cutting ties with the British monarch's court, meaning the highest court of appeal for Jamaica right now, which is the Privy Council. Again, he went on to say, how can the vast majority of Jamaicans be left behind in a process of decolonisation and continue to be deprived of access to justice at the highest level? And basically, he put forward 4 questions for the government to answer, and he said he requires an answer to the 4 questions from the government before the opposition will basically move forward any further. So what are these questions? The first one is, are the people of Jamaica not entitled to be told why the CCJ bills that were tabled 10 years ago haven't been tabled again? They were actually debated in the Senate in 2015. Question number 2. The history of the reform process has birthed a certain distrust factor. And wouldn't the government like to put that behind them before proceeding on this historic process? The third question, is the government not under a duty to explain why they want to proceed in this piecemeal fashion, like the 3 phases, instead of taking the opportunity, which phase 1 not including the final court of appeal, I guess, being the emphasis in that respect. Instead of taking the opportunity to ensure that the majority of Jamaican people enjoy access to justice to their highest court. He went on to say the CCJ is a globally respected institution and it's internationally acclaimed as being excellent. And the 4th question was, would the people and we ourselves not regard it as a welcome sign of maturity and wisdom to witness an agreement between the parties on the settled way forward for success on these new arrangements, regardless of who wins the upcoming election? And is this not an appropriate juncture for this to be accomplished? Mr. Golden then went on to say, the government is leading Jamaica into a situation where Jamaicans have to get a visa and pay millions of dollars to enjoy entry into their highest court, the same court of the abandoned British monarch. He said that, there are other serious concerns about some of the contents of the bill, but the question of access to justice in the interest of the Jamaican people must be addressed first. So he concluded saying, therefore, as from the adjournment of this meeting, they are requesting being excused from further participation in the committee, pending the answers to those questions being given to the public by the Prime Minister. So Ms. Malahoo fought, saying, okay, that's not an unreasonable ask, but obviously there are differences in perspectives from the 2 political parties. And she didn't feel like it was piecemeal, saying that there's research that says when you attempt to do everything at once, it fails. But again, I think the main issue here is the Caribbean Court of justice. Ms. Malahoo Ford, she referenced some of the matters like, it's not the subject matter, there's a fear of a referendum, right? That people won't vote on the subject matter, but on the performance of the government. And that the Prime Minister doesn't want to risk, destabilising democracy in case these small changes cause chaos. She also references the fact that appeals to a final court tend to be a very small amount according to data, and culture tends to determine the extent of the matters that are appealed. She went on to say that full decolonisation won't be achieved by removing the final court, because what troubles Jamaica is more than anything else some deep cultural issues, and talks about the emancipation of the mind, etc., and that there's a distrust on both sides and in society, which will need work, and that their work is cut out. I beg to differ. I would really like to know what you think on that matter, actually, whether what Miss Malahoo Ford is saying about why this issue of the Caribbean Court of Justice shouldn't be addressed now, because of this fear of putting it to a referendum. And we're going to come back to that statement on distrust on both sides and in society. We're going to talk about that a little bit more further down in this episode. So Donna Scott Motley did enter the discussion and pointed out that the ask is not for everything, it's for the CCJ, which is a small point in terms of time, but and process, but of significance nationally. And that the public really need to understand the reservation that the government has about the CCJ, and why there is this, they feel wedded to the Privy Council as a final court. And she described it almost like, in terms of an incomplete divorce, right? You have a decree nisi, which will never become absolute. For those not familiar, a divorce is in two stages. You have your decree nisi, but you're not divorced until you get your decree absolute. So I guess what she's saying is, that's what the opposition have been saying, like, Jamaica's not fully decolonized because while you're removing the king, you're leaving the court, right? So she went on to say that the duty at this stage, and not at a future stage, is to explain to the people of Jamaica why the Privy Council is to remain as the final court, even as we leave the monarchy, and in the face of overwhelming support from almost every other forum. And I'm gonna mention some of those forums who support a move to the Caribbean Court of Justice now. As I previously mentioned, there was a bill to leave the Privy Council and become a member of the CCJ, not only for the treaty the interpretation of the treaty purposes, but also part of the to come under its appellate jurisdiction, right? That was actually, and I'm going to reference a statement that was actually made by the then Minister of Justice, Mark Golding, in the Senate in 2015. And he identified in his statement organizations who were in support, right, for the CCJ. And they basically said, it is important at this juncture of our national development, this is back in 2015, of course, to raise our collective influence and voices to support the process by which the CCJ will become Jamaica's final appellate court. Our respective entities have had various consultations, either within the respective membership of each entity, successive Jamaican governments and other organisations in Jamaica, or regionally as regards the CCJ. So we have the following organisations: the Jamaican Bar Association, the Organisation of Commonwealth Caribbean Bar Associations, the Cornwall Bar Association, the Law Faculty of UTEC, Lawyers Christian Fellowship, the Jamaica Civil Service Association, the National Integrity Action, and the University and Allied Workers Union. Then they actually then moved on to procedural matters. Ms. Malahoo-Fort confirmed that not everything in the report made it into the bill. There were revisions made regarding the appointment process of a president as a direct response to the feedback received from the Leader of the Opposition and the two former Prime Ministers who voiced their opinion on that matter. Prime Ministers Golding and Patterson. And a lot of the other people raised concerns regarding that as well. And this is relevant to that mistrust issue that we were talking about before, right? Because the nature of the way in which the president was going to be appointed was hotly rejected, right? It was re-emphasised, again, this is now talking procedure, that this will not be a revisit of the CRC process, but a deliberation of the provisions of the bill, as is the job of the Joint Select Committee. There was a discussion regarding whether members of the public were invited to send feedback to the committee, inviting submissions, and whether those persons would be permitted to do a presentation or consideration on paper. And basically that, the work of the committee, they'd spend the first few meetings going through the bill clause by clause while they awaited submissions from the public. But this again caused some conversation, because it's kind of like, okay, if we're going to be tweaking the bill, then it's not what the public's going to see, right? So there was this desire to iron out at what point wouldn't it be better to, have the public see what has already been tweaked. And Ms. Donna Scott Motley added, to that, look, a referendum, it's important for people to understand what they're voting for, or the easiest thing for somebody to do is vote no. And she does want a yes. Okay, so special invitees were discussed. Norma Manley Law School, JAMBAR, the JFJ, JAMP, UE, UTEC, and NCU, Northern Caribbean University. And it was confirmed that, as others come to mind, that they could be added to the list. It was also put forward that other government offices should be involved, so that the notice of the ability to make submissions by the public could be placed in offices like the tax office. Shireen Golding Campbell was also saying that the communications manager of Parliament has a whole wealth of recommendations that she could put forward. So engaging her would be good in order to ensure the widest dissemination of this information. And also Senator Braham said that the notice should specify that the diaspora are also invited to make submissions. Thank you, Senator Braham. Now, the next meeting is scheduled for actually tomorrow, January 22 at 10 o'clock. I'll put out an update if it warrants it, otherwise it'll be in the next episode. So, now what does this really mean to the public, especially those who were eligible to vote in the referendum, right? Well, way back when all of this started, I read an article by Rosalie Hamilton, right? She's an academic. She's a trade policy specialist. She's an advocate, radio host, and the founding director of the Institute of Law and Economics. And she spoke about why the economy and governance are essential to successful constitutional reform. Basically, how it will benefit the ordinary guy, right? So I'm going to read you some parts of this article that she wrote, and it was in the Ward Post, and it's called Our Jamaican Republic, The Bread and Butter Issues. And it was written July 26, 2022. So the central objective of creating a republic, this is what she's saying, is to make sure that there isn't a link anymore to the central role of the unjust monarchical system, right? Which basically just supported oppressive laws. It created institutions like slavery and colonization, right? So the object is to move away from all of that by creating the republic. That unjust monarchical system also created laws that prevented and restricted land titling to free Africans. Those restrictions stifled economic opportunities to own or control property for business development, and created squatting communities that have persisted as part of Jamaica's colonial legacy. So the transition to a republic is an opportunity to modify and create laws, policies, and institutional arrangements that empower the Jamaican people to improve their standard of living. She goes on to state, recent empirical evidence from 128 countries suggests that raising a country's standard of living will require simultaneously devoting resources to three key activities: growing its capacity to innovate, building its capacity to produce and export goods and services, and upgrading its institutions, especially those related to law and business. And critical to these three activities that drive global competitiveness is the quality of the education system. So you see where the problems are already, right? And what this constitutional reform is not addressing. She goes on to say that to improve living standards in Jamaica, we must transform some key institutions, especially those that improve education, health, innovation, governance, and global competitiveness. And that the process will not only require removing the king as head of state, it was the queen at that time, but she did now, but will also improve governance, should also improve governance and our entrepreneurial support systems, especially for innovators such as those in the creative and cultural industries that can produce globally competitive goods and services. Importantly, the process also requires the active engagement of people in shaping the republic that they want, right? That public education, so as to achieve the bread and butter outcomes that they want. Among other things, our Constitution has two key features. It determines it determines fundamental rights and freedoms, and it regulates the machinery of government, including its relationship with the people, both directly affecting standard of living. Now, let's focus on that machinery of government. I took this passage from Philosophies and the Philosophies and Opinions of Mosiah Garvey. Government is a centralized authority for the purpose of expressing the will of the people. Before you can have a government, you must have the people. Without the people, there can be no government. The government must be, therefore, an expression of the will of the people. The article goes on to say, constitutional provisions that regulate the machinery of government, including mechanisms to hold the people's representatives accountable, also affect the standard of living of Jamaicans. Accountability in the management of public funds and effective oversight matter. It's estimated that the cost of corruption to the Jamaican economy is more than 100 billion Jamaican dollars. That's about 5 to 7% of GDP annually. With improved accountability, savings from a lower corruption cost can be redirected to innovative, income-earning activities that can improve the average income of Jamaicans on an annual basis. Constitutional and other legal or policy changes to improve accountability include impeachment provisions. A code of conduct for parliamentarians and participatory budgeting. It's when people actively participate in decision-making through formal, established mechanisms such as hearings and petitions that people can influence bread and butter decisions. So, as was said in that article, which referenced impeachment provisions, there are none in this bill, right? And this is a pivotal moment, right, for Jamaica. It's a pivotal moment for Jamaica to regulate, things like corruption, holding people accountable. And this brings us back to this whole mistrust thing again, right? It is thought to be a huge issue that there are no impeachment provisions for a president or members of parliament in this bill. Yeah, those mechanisms and accountability policy changes are obviously needed because the scandals continue to plague Parliament. One of them, in particular, Leslie Campbell. Campbell's a former member of Parliament, a senator and junior foreign minister who was found guilty for failing to comply with repeated requests from the Integrity Commission for additional information about his statutory declaration spanning over several years. The former lawmaker is scheduled to be sentenced on April 4. There are calls for imprisonment, not just a fine. There's an article that was in the Gleaner, August 11, 2019, called 30 Years of Political Scandals. And I'm going to just take a couple of excerpts from that article. It basically says that a lack of adequate accountability in corruption allegations erodes public trust. in the last 30 years, only one government minister has served jail time for the misuse of public resources. Senator James A.G. Smith, former Minister of Labour and Public Service in the 1980s, remains the only Jamaican politician imprisoned for mismanaging public funds. He was charged on February 13, 1990, and was sentenced to 5 years in prison for diverting money from farm workers for personal gain. I want to touch on an article, right? Another one that was in the Gleaner, December 29, 2024, and it's called Jamaican Economy Facing Challenges in 2025. Politics Will Be a Factor, and it's written by Don Anderson. And basically he says, the Jamaican economy is facing serious challenges going into the first quarter of 2025, and political decisions are likely to play an important role over the next few months. In the September 2024 quarter, the economy fell by 2.8% compared to year earlier levels. On the question of remittances, that is money coming from the diaspora into Jamaica, Anderson noticed that since the start of the pandemic to 2024, the percentage of households receiving remittances has actually fallen by 6% to under 27% of households. It means that there's a significant shortfall in the ability of people to meet their daily expenses. And it means that at a time when people are skeptical about the economy going forward, people are getting less money in their pocket through a remittance system. And the reason that I wanted to point out that article about remittances, is because Jamaica, about 18.9% of Jamaica's GDP in 2023 was from remittances. That information comes from an article, right, by Ransford Smith called Remittances and Development, Making Silk Purse Out of Sow's Ear, that was written in July 2024. And he basically says that it doesn't speak well. It speaks not to economic well-being, but to an economic need and even to impoverishment for a country to depend on remittances. It's viewed as negative political economy, a negative political economy effect, and moral hazard. Those are associated with remittances. He goes on to say that individuals who are frustrated with the lack of opportunities at home migrate rather than becoming politically active, and instead they send remittances back to support those who stay behind. Those who remain also lack the incentive to put pressure on the government to reform, because remittances partly compensate them for the negative consequences of government policy. Therefore, the country persists in a state characterized by low growth, poor economic policy, and high remittances. So what's next? I'm going to leave you with an article by Rosalie Hamilton from the Jamaica Gleaner, December 29, 2024, and it's entitled Constitutional Amendment Bill and Referendum Vote. This is the first legal step in the process of reforming the Constitution to establish a Jamaican Republic. The process requires Jamaicans to vote in a referendum about the legal framework that will underpin the future development of our country. But what exactly will we vote for? The bill contains a complexity of issues. Some I support, but others I reject and see as dangerous for Jamaica's future. It's time to end inadequate parliamentary oversight of executive action that made it possible for 3 trillion Jamaican dollars in unaccounted expenditures to accumulate over 11 years. Our children deserve a better future. So if the referendum decision is a direct or indirect vote to retain the parliamentary cabinet system of government without governance changes, my vote in the referendum is no. People who are eligible to vote in Jamaica, if you're not registered to vote, March 31, 2025 is the deadline to register for the next voters list, which is scheduled to then be published on May 31, 2025. I hope you're continuing to enjoy this journey, finding it educational and useful and tame. The Prime Minister Andrew Holness declared the roads of Jamaica as a national emergency. This one definitely qualifies. I believe we're driving on the rims of a couple of flat tires right now. Our travels on the road to Jamaica becoming a republic continue. But I'm still confident the journey is going to end with a truly independent, fully decolonized and sovereign Jamaica, land we love. You can find this podcast on YouTube, Buzzsprout, Spotify, Podcast Index, Deezer, Podcast Addict, Apple, iHeartRadio, and Amazon Music. And if you want to reason about anything or you can't find any of the material I was talking about, you can email me on atasteofja@outlook.com. So until the next time, thank you for supporting this podcast. Please subscribe, follow, and share it with your family and friends. And again, I thank you for taking the time to listen. One love. Yes, the word is love.